History as it happens, April 14th, 2022. Liberal democracy in retreat?
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocrats, autocratic governments around the world.
President Putin delivered another televised address and offered the absurd pretext that he sought the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
NATO has never been more united than it is today.
Is Ukraine the front line in a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, liberalism versus illiberal nationalism? Our guest says yes, rebuking the realists who say the war in Eastern Europe is not a vital U.S. national security interest. But if the end of history was the ideal of liberal democracy, then Russia's war of aggression cannot go unchallenged. That's next, as we speak to Francis Fukuyama, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The momentum for freedom does not just come from the printed word or the transistor or the television screen. It comes from a single powerful idea: democracy.
It is an important country to the United States precisely because the issue right now in Ukraine is not simply limited to Ukraine. Putin has made it very clear that he wants to overturn the entire European order.
Liberalism is in peril. The fundamentals of liberal societies are tolerance of difference, respect for individual rights, and the rule of law. And all are under threat as the world suffers what can be called a democratic recession or even a depression. Those are the words of Francis Fukuyama, writing in Foreign Affairs. The essay is titled Liberalism Needs the Nation. The esteemed Stanford political scientist and member of the Council on Foreign Relations cites research from Freedom House, its annual Freedom in the World study. It says the present threat to democracy is the product of 16 consecutive years of decline in global freedom. A total of 60 countries suffered declines over the past year, the study says, while only 25 improved. As of today, some 38% of the global population live in not free countries, the highest proportion since 1997, and only about 20% now live in what the study calls free countries. It's hard to argue with the evidence that democracy is taking some hits around the world, including in the United States. But does that reflect a global struggle tantamount to the one that divided the world during the Cold War, when two competing sets of ideas defined international relations? When the Cold War was ending, Fukuyama wrote his famous work, The End of History and the Last Man, in which he hypothesized that the results of the Cold War meant the ideal of liberal democracy could not be surpassed as a way of organizing a modern state. And that view was shared by American politicians even before the final collapse of the USSR. President George Bush, May 1989 in Germany, pledging U.S. support for a Europe whole and free. I mean, who could be blamed for believing democracy was on the march at that point?
But the passion for freedom cannot be denied forever. The world has waited long enough. The time is right. Let Europe be whole and free. The momentum for freedom does not just come from the printed word or the transistor or the television screen. It comes from a single powerful idea: democracy.
2.5 years later, Christmas 1991, the USSR vanishes and Bush declares victory.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
And in the next decade and a half, one former Eastern Bloc country and Soviet republic after another would join NATO. Ukraine, as we know, wound up on the other side of Europe's new dividing line. And now this terrible war in Ukraine is leading some, from neocon interventionists to liberal intellectuals, to believe the European order forged after the Cold War is teetering, and that a system of authoritarianism is imperiling the fragile gains of liberal democracy, all the more concerning because the catastrophes of the 20th century had compelled the West to try to solve the problems of the era of the nation-state. Easier said than done. In fact, our guest has a new book coming out next month about this issue. Its title is Liberalism and Its Discontents. Francis Fukuyama, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So I promise my first question will not be, what did you mean by the end of history? We'll get to that later. That is old news, as we say in the business. We'll talk about your recent essay in Foreign Affairs. A Country of Their Own, Liberalism Needs the Nation is the title. You say we are witnessing a democratic recession or even a depression in democracy. I guess it is hard to argue with the evidence that democracy is getting beaten up in certain parts of the world. But why is this a recession or a depression and not just a minor setback of liberalism in some parts of the world?
Well, it's really a matter of scale. Freedom House, the organization that publishes Freedom in the World every year, has measures of democracy, aggregate measures, both for individual countries and for the world as a whole. And that aggregate has been declining now for 16 straight years. And it's also declined in certain really important countries like India and the United States, which are two of the world's largest democracies. And then you have the rise of authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, the rise of populist movements within existing democracies. So collectively, I think that implies a fairly serious setback for global democracy. And, that's really what the democratic recession is all about.
The comparison to 1920s, 1930s Europe is often made, but we are not at that level. That was a wholesale disaster when fascist dictatorships rose, communist dictatorships rose, and democratic countries disappeared or swallowed up. We're not at that level.
No, I think that's right. The aggregate number of democracies in 1970 was maybe something in the range of 30 to 35, and then you had this big expansion in the number where it went up to about 115 altogether. It's been falling, but it's nowhere near the point where it was actually just in the 1970s, not to speak of the 1930s. So in that respect, we're still doing okay. But compared to the way the world was just a generation ago, it doesn't look as good.
I think you're right about that. Comparing it to the Hitler era is not the wisest move because many of the parallels are weak. Some have argued that there is an autocratic system at work or that authoritarian governments coordinate globally to roll back democracy. Do you agree with that?
There are different forms of that. Russia and China obviously have been working closely together. Putin and Xi met at the Beijing Olympics and pledged that they would cooperate without limits. Exactly what that means, nobody really knows because Xi does not seem to be all that happy with what's happened in Ukraine, but nonetheless, that's been an issue. There's other forms of cooperation. Putin has been at the center of a global authoritarian populist network where he's given support to individual populist leaders like Viktor Orban or Marine Le Pen, Bolsonaro, or Donald Trump. He's also supported a variety of authoritarian leaders like Assad in Syria or Maduro in Venezuela. So there's a lot of ties. Some of them are bilateral, some of them are based on a kind of looser network of like-minded states, but there is definitely a lot of cooperation.
Some of those leaders were democratically elected, though. Does that matter? I do want to get to Hungary, but go ahead.
It matters in that it's better to have at least some democratic accountability than to be a full authoritarian state like China. But, the real deficit, I think, is not so much in democracy as in liberalism. Liberalism understood as a rule of law and constitutional checks on executive power that limit what executives can do. And in that respect, I think that a country like Hungary does have legitimate elections, but it's not a liberal state in the sense that it doesn't respect exactly those kinds of limits on power.
I want to return to Hungary in a moment, but back to Russia, Ukraine. In your essay, you make the argument that what's going on in Ukraine right now is the front line in this global struggle between democracy, liberal democracy on the one hand, and authoritarianism or autocracy on the other. My view is that what is happening in Ukraine, while of course very important and is an outright tragedy, the Russian war of aggression has already resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe. is not a core interest of the United States. This is what Barack Obama said in 2016 in his interview with The Atlantic. His view was that Russia was a regional power, not a strong country, and not something the United States needed to be obsessed with as it was during the Cold War.
I think we've seen that that's just wrong. It is an important country to the United States precisely because the issue right now in Ukraine is not simply limited to Ukraine. Putin has made it very clear that he wants to overturn the entire European order, the Europe whole and free that the United States worked to build at the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and the spread of democracy throughout Eastern Europe and into important parts of the former Soviet Union. And that democratic order is important, for our security at home. We want to live in a world that has more democracies rather than fewer. And Ukraine was just, the first part of a serial aggression that Putin has been planning for a long time. So I do think it is a core interest of the United States.
Is it your view that Putin might try to attack other countries in this fashion? Because it's already been shown, although it's only been 6-7 weeks, that his attempt at Ukraine has been a fiasco.
Yeah, well, fortunately, he seems to be a really bad strategist, and there's some very important mistakes and deficits on the Russian side that's protected Ukraine. But I think there's no question that if he had succeeded in overthrowing the Zelensky government within the first 72 hours of the war, he would move on to other targets. He's already occupying parts of Georgia, parts of Moldova. He's threatened the Baltic states. And I think actually the threat to Eastern Europe would be what we'd be worrying about right now if Ukraine had been absorbed.
You really believe Russia wants to reincorporate Poland?
No, not into Russia itself, but they definitely want to extend their sphere of influence all the way back to the territory that the former Soviet Union, they've said this explicitly in the negotiations prior to the war. One of their demands was that NATO not provide any assistance to any of the states that entered in the 1990s. So yeah, that includes Poland, Baltic states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, you name it. Their ambitions, I think, are really quite extensive.
So you mentioned Hungary in your foreign affairs essay as an example of liberalism in retreat, a nation whose leadership is focusing on ethnic nationalism. I'd like to share some observations by Damon Linker. He's a columnist at The Week, and get your thoughts on them regarding the notion that Hungary is part of this larger autocratic movement. Linker says Hungarians are choosing an illiberal leader, Viktor Orban, the so-called illiberal populist. He does note Orban's media consolidation and gerrymandering, but that Orban has lots of legitimate support outside of the cities, and this pattern, Linker says, has been reproduced across the democratic world in recent years. The provinces are uniting politically against urban progressive establishments. Now, you might say that is what brought Trump to power in 2016. It brought Orban to power back in 2010. And to this day, a majority of Hungarians want Orban as their leader. What's your view of that?
Yeah, well, I think that we in the United States are not believers in just democracy without liberalism. We're believers in liberal democracy, meaning that government power should be limited, that all members of the democratic community should have their rights respected, that should be based on a rule of law through constitutional checks and balances. And so, yeah, he's legitimately elected. Nobody's going to contest that. But an illiberal democracy is inferior to a liberal one because there isn't any genuine contestation. And then, when a figure like Orban can accumulate that much power, he can then go after the democratic part of the equation as well through things like gerrymandering, manipulation of the press, and so forth. So it ultimately does become a threat to democracy.
And Damon Linker's final point, or at least this is my inference, liberals and leftists have to get better at politics. They have to offer an agenda to people within these countries, including in the United States, that is better than the one they're getting from the populist right. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's the case. I think that the degree to which they've done that varies from one country to another. There's some demands by the populist right, I think, that are really not ones that can be met, having to do with some basic issues of national identity and the role of, race and gender and that sort of thing in it. But there's no question that the elites have failed in certain important ways. I think in the early 21st century, you had the Iraq War and the financial crisis, both of which were the result of certain bad policies and bad ideas. In that respect, it's not surprising that people are upset.
You've been making this argument for quite a while, going back to your book, The End of History and the Last Man. You state the need for democratic states to work together to promote democracy and international peace is an idea almost as old as liberalism itself. In this new essay, you make the case for liberal nationalism. What is liberal nationalism?
Well, I think that all political systems need to be embedded in a nation or national identity. Nationalism has had a bad odor really due to the aggressive and exclusive forms of national identity that were prevalent in Europe in the 19th century and then ultimately were the basis of the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century. Those forms of nationalism are obviously dangerous, and both to people living in those societies and to their neighbors. And we're seeing actually a version of it right now unrolling in Russia, where the Russian national identity does not seem to be separable from the desire to dominate all of the smaller countries around Russia's periphery and to deny the possibility of sovereignty to a country that doesn't want to be part of Russia. That was exactly the issue that led to the Second World War, is Hitler's form of nationalism. But you can have a liberal form of national identity if you base it on liberal ideas, meaning that the national identity cannot be based on a fixed category like ethnicity or race, or really, for that matter, religion. It has to be more inclusive, such that the actual diversity of the people living within the society have a chance of participating. That's something I think that a liberal society, not only is that not incompatible with liberalism, I think it's a kind of necessary condition for liberalism to exist.
You note the challenge in reconciling these two ideas, liberalism and nationalism. I mean, it's always been a challenge here in the United States because we Americans do not share a common ancestry or religion or common language even. So it's always going to be a challenge, right? Not just here, but everywhere.
Yes, but I think that by the end of the civil rights era in the 20th century, I think the United States had arrived at a form of democratic or liberal national identity that was quite workable. We had developed a kind of civic national identity that was built around the U.S. Constitution, belief in the rule of law, belief in democracy, that was not racially based. It did not exclude women. It really included the actual diversity of the people living in the territory of the United States. And I think that that's the kind of national identity that other democracies have. Australia, Canada, France, all of these countries don't try to define themselves in ethnic terms. They define themselves in civic terms. And I think that's really important for any country that wants to be a liberal democracy.
Post-World War II Europe and then post-Cold War Europe, when the Eastern Bloc dissolved and those nations that had been living under Soviet domination became democratic, the problem of the 20th century, ethnic nationalism, had been removed or solved in a way because of the carnage of the Second World War. In a sense, the vision of Hitler and Stalin was realized because these countries no longer had ethnic minorities within their boundaries, for the most part. I mean, there were population transfers as well between Turkey and Greece, for example, which was a lot different than the post-World War I order, where ethnic minorities suddenly found themselves living in new nation states based on where borders had just been redrawn, and there were resentments because some nations of people achieved statehood while others did not. So maybe it was to be expected that we're seeing a return to some degree of ethnic nationalism in some of these places in Europe because ethnic minorities have been removed from the picture, which in a very perverse way led to some of the peace that we saw the last 3/4 of a century. You see what I'm saying, or do you disagree?
Well, no, I mean, it is the case that to the degree that you get ethnic homogeneity in Europe, it was based on a lot of violence in previous centuries and generations, and authoritarian methods, basically what we call ethnic cleansing, in order to homogenize populations. And so in that sense, modern democracies that are liberal are the inheritors of nations that had been created through non-liberal means. And, that's something that a lot of people in democracies don't want to admit to themselves. But in fact, if you have this kind of ethnic heterogeneity, and you have, for example, a big fight over what's the national language, because there's a large ethnic minority that speaks a different language, like in Canada, you're going to get fights over that are hard to resolve through democratic means. So that's correct. The question, though, is to what extent do you actually formalize that homogeneity and make it a condition for things like citizenship? And that's what's really troubling. I mean, in Hungary, Orban has said that Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity. So if you're not a Hungarian, you're somehow not part of the nation. If you're Jewish, for example, you're not really part of the nation. The other big problem with Hungary is that there's several million Hungarians living outside of Hungary. They all get to vote in Hungarian elections, and ultimately there's a lot of unhappiness among Hungarian nationalists of the peace treaty that followed World War I that took those areas away from Hungary. And so there's an international dimension to it that in the future could lead to a lot of instability. Fortunately, Hungary is a small country. It's embedded in the EU, so it's not about to invade Romania and take back the Hungarian minority in Transylvania. But it is still a sore point for a lot of Hungarian nationalists. And that's what happens if you base national identity on these ethnic considerations.
We're still burying the Treaty of Versailles, apparently. So what you said before, I agree with about it's better for each democracy if there are more democratic countries in the world. The issue is, how do we get to that? And there's that old Wilsonian term, the world must be made safe for democracy. He did not mean that the United States or any country should be going around trying to turn non-democratic countries into democracies. It was about protecting countries that were already democratic from having to subject their people to the kind of discipline, regimentation, militarism that was prevalent at the time in, say, Kaiser's Germany. Before I move on to my question, do you agree with that framing, the way I place that?
Yeah, well, I think that Wilsonianism in that sense has been a component of American foreign policy on and off. It's never been the dominant single objective of American foreign policy, but it has been important to the way that Americans think about their country. The dollar bill has this Masonic symbol of the Great Pyramid with the all-seeing eye, and under it is the inscription Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Centuries, which I think represented an idea going all the way back to the American founding that the kind of liberal democracy that America was trying to create was not something that just applied to the English colonists that settled North America, but it had a broader significance for the world as a whole. And I do think that that's the way that Americans have thought about their democratic experiment for a very long time.
So how do we get there? How do we get more liberal nationalism? It can't be imposed from the outside.
We owe solidarity. So when a democracy is attacked, like Ukraine is being attacked right now, we prudently try to help it. Economic ties, trade have always been seen as ways of strengthening economies and therefore strengthening the legitimacy of regimes. We can give advice. We are very supportive of civil society movements in various other countries. So, there's a variety of ways that solidarity has been expressed.
Do you see yourself as a foreign policy realist or idealist, or is that the wrong question to ask?
Well, I wrote a book in the wake of the Iraq War called America at the Crossroads, and I tried to articulate what I called a realistic Wilsonianism. So I'm basically I believe that democracy and support for democracy globally has to be a component of American foreign policy, but we just need to be more prudent in the way that we apply it. And I think the Iraq War was an example of not doing it in a prudent way. In fact, it was a very foolish. We didn't invade Iraq to spread democracy, which is a common view among many people. We did it because we mistakenly thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And then when the Bush administration discovered there were no weapons, they were looking around for a reason why they'd launched this invasion, and they started to try to justify it in terms of democratizing Iraq. And that, I think, had several terrible consequences because it then associated democracy promotion in the minds of many people around the world with military invasion. And that, was really never the way that democracy promotion was ever intended to happen, from Woodrow Wilson on.
The freedom agenda came after the fact. George W. Bush's second inaugural address, where he mentions the word freedom dozens of times without actually defining it. That was ex post facto because of the WMD. I'm still not sure exactly what the precise motivations were for that epic disaster, but I have placed U.S. foreign policy since 9/11, pretty much the entirety of it, into the category of disaster. But not to digress about that, although it is important. So I'd like to return to the framing of democracy versus autocracy. The realists would argue that nations' behavior is not determined by their form of government. They pursue what they believe to be their own best interests. Thus, Russia is not trying to impose authoritarianism over the whole of Eastern Europe again. It's interested in Ukraine because of the unique history between those two nations and the Russian view that Ukraine is part of Russia.
Well, the trouble with realism is that it's a very abstract doctrine, and it kind of treats every nation as a billiard ball where the inside is not visible to anyone from the outside, but they all carom the same way and they follow, similar kinds of trajectories. And I think if you just look around the world, that's not true, that the nature of the regime really does affect the way it behaves towards other countries. And I think one of the arguments against authoritarian government has been because it lacks internal checks and balances, it's not going to observe moderate checks on its own foreign policy and the way that it behaves towards other countries. And I think that you can see that playing out in Russian foreign policy right now. Putin is the sole decision maker. He doesn't have to really go to his legislature. He doesn't even seem to have much of a coterie of advisors around him. They all have to sit 25 feet away from him. So he's very isolated. I doubt that he gets very honest intelligence assessments. It's probably almost impossible for anybody to actually contradict him or criticize anything that he's done. And so the kind of mistake that he's made, I think, is a direct product of the form of government that he's created within Russia. Whereas if you had a democracy in which power is divided across different branches, in which you have regular procedures for vetting policies, you're simply not going to make mistakes of that sort. Your policy may come more slowly and not quite as decisively, but it's going to be vetted and it'll be more durable, I think, for that reason.
Although we could look at the U.S. and Iraq, but calling the U.S. a democracy while we're also a military empire, it's a contradiction. Our democracy is being eroded, in my view, by the costs of our military imperium.
Well, look, you're using the word empire, rather loosely. We have bases all over the world. We have them in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, many other places, but these are all done on the basis of voluntary agreements with the host country. And if they want to kick us out like the Philippines did, a few years ago, we're going to leave. So if you call that empire, it's a very different kind of empire than the one that existed when colonialism, was the mode of interaction.
The U.S. empire is definitely different than colonial empires, the Roman Empire, but I do believe it is an empire.
Well, okay. If you want to use that word, that's fine. But I think that, I would say network of alliances is probably more like it.
One of the more trenchant observations in your essay is that where the world is going, where humanity is going, we may need supranational or international bodies to make some really important decisions. In the globalized world, as you put it, power is employed, reading from your essay here, by a wide variety of bodies, multinational corporations, nonprofit groups, terrorist organizations. We can also add big tech platforms such as Facebook, which have more power over speech than arguably any government in human history. But you observe that liberal democracies really have no idea how to create supranational institutions. So how do we solve that problem, especially when it comes to dealing with climate change, where individual nations want to potentially keep burning fossil fuel, which is not good for the globe?
Well, I don't think you can solve it through a supranational organization. I mean, that's the argument I was trying to make. International cooperation will have to remain based on nation states well into the future for exactly the reason that you cited, that we cannot create a global executive that is therefore going to be constrained by a global legislature or a global judiciary. That's really the way that democracy works domestically in an established democracy. You have a powerful state, but a state that's constrained. And it seems to me when you move this to an international level with a heterogeneous collection of countries, it's either going to be so weak that it's not going to accomplish anything, or if it actually does create a powerful global executive, it's going to be a kind of global dictatorship. And that's why I just think it's a bad idea. Plus which, it's so unrealistic. If you can imagine the United States or China somehow giving up sovereignty to a global body anytime in the coming decades, I think it's just not going to happen. And so that's why I think people should not waste time thinking about that.
And we can see the UN, correct, with the Security Council, which is proving to be no Security Council at all.
You can't really have any kind of cooperative political organization unless you have a certain set of shared values. And I think at that global level, those values just don't exist, and therefore any organization that encompasses such a heterogeneous group of nations is really not going to be an effective organization.
So the book for which you are most well known, The End of History and the Last Man, published some 30 years ago. People have been misinterpreting or misunderstanding what you meant by that. You did not mean end as in termination. Time did not stop in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. You meant end as in the aim or the goal, and history as in development, the development of societies. You were applying Hegel. Which of your assumptions about how the post-Cold War world would develop have not been realized, or what surprised you about the past 30 years?
I wrote a big 2-volume series on political order. The first volume came out in 2011, The Origins of Political Order. And then in 2014, I published Political Order and Political Decay. And that was really my effort to rewrite the end of history based on just knowing a lot more about human history at that point. And there's a couple of different new elements in that. The first was just a recognition of the importance of the state and how difficult it is to create a modern state, meaning one that is uncorrupt and impersonal. And the other idea was the idea of political decay, this idea that you can become a liberal democracy that seems to be fairly effective, but you can also go backwards and you can undo your democracy. And I think these ideas are related to each other because it's actually very hard to maintain a modern state in the face of pressures for, rent-seeking, elite capture, all of the things that afflict modern political systems. There are other issues that I didn't anticipate. The weaponization of the internet that has actually made just agreement on factual information very difficult.
The information ecosystem that we're dealing with today is truly unprecedented. Unprecedented is an overused word, but not in this case.
Well, that's definitely the case. And then, I kind of frankly thought that at least American voters they could make a mistake in the short run, but they would end up correcting it. And that, I think, has not really been borne out by the events over the last few years, which then kind of leads you into questioning a lot of the assumptions about human rationality that I think are embedded in the kind of liberal story of historical progress. I don't think it negates that theory, but these are challenges that I hadn't really foreseen, and I think they've been playing out in the current crisis of global democracy.
Well, human beings, generally speaking, are not good at predicting the future, so you should not be held to a different standard, because
Right.
I don't think any of us can truly know what's coming. However, I do believe that the West, maybe you disagree with me, in its celebratory mood at the end of the Cold War, overestimated the appeal of liberal democracy, or maybe underestimated how difficult it would be for some of these places to make that transition.
Yeah, I think it was rather the latter than the former that actually, and again, as I said, one of the things that's extremely difficult is getting to a modern state where you have an impersonal bureaucracy that is competent, that is not highly corrupt, that doesn't rest on patronage and payoffs, to political supporters, this sort of thing. It's very difficult to create that kind of a political system, and therefore a lot of states remain kind of democratic. They've kind of got a rule of law, but they've got high levels of corruption. They don't have efficient economies as a result, and they seem to be kind of stuck there, and there are a lot of countries in that situation.
I believe in The End of History, I have the book right here, you argue that the ideal of liberal democracy could not be improved upon. China obviously thinks differently under Xi Jinping, really over the past 30 years as it liberalized its economy without liberalizing its politics. It believes that this is the correct model to continue to pull millions of people out of poverty with its Belt and Road Initiative, helping folks who were left behind, as they see it, by neoliberalism. What's your analysis of that and China's potential primacy, soon global primacy?
Well, look, I think we're just going to have to wait and see how long they can keep it up. I'm surprised that they've actually maintained stability and growth for as long as they have, but there are potentially big problems in both their economic system and in their political system. The crackdown on technology companies that's occurred over the past year is, something that, if we believe our own assumptions about the nature of market economies, is going to hurt them a great deal. That's the most productive, innovative part of the Chinese economy. And if the state wants to control all that activity, they're going to get less entrepreneurship, less growth, less innovation. The other thing I would say is that the part of the China model that's really not attractive is the social part. People admire the fact that they're getting rich all the time. But if you think about, where do refugees want to go, to get a better life when they're living in a poor country or a badly governed one or a corrupt dictatorship, they don't go to China, right? That's not most people's idea of a great place to live, where they got a social model that really suits them. I think they actually want to live in a free society where they can make decisions about their own lives. The government isn't telling them what to do all the time. And that, I think, in the long run is going to be a big liability for that society. It's going to work as long as the government seems like it's making good decisions, but I don't think any authoritarian government can keep up the record. And you're seeing this right now. I think their policy towards COVID right now is completely crazy. This idea that they're going to try to stamp out every single case of the disease by locking down as much of the country as they need to.
Separating kids and parents.
Yeah, it's something actually that only could happen in that kind of a dictatorship, and I think it's not a workable system in the end.
Modern authoritarian states such as China have tools that previous ones did not, however, and that is surveillance technology. China's been described as the most sophisticated surveillance state ever. And as we know, authoritarian countries can continue to turn the screws of repression. The Soviet Union, its collapse was not inevitable. It could have clamped down. Gorbachev decided not to, and he let the wheels of reform basically spin out of control there. Not to digress about the USSR. I guess my point is that China has shown that you can continue to keep people under a regime in which they have no civil liberties, no religious liberty, right? But as long as you're pulling them out of poverty, you can make the case that this is the model for the future.
Well, maybe.
I don't know. I hope that's not the case.
We'll have to see if the Chinese people themselves are satisfied with that kind of a life. And I suspect over time they may not be.
Francis Fukuyama, and once more his new book, out soon, is Liberalism and Its Discontents. For more on the issue of China, I invite you to go back and listen to my episode titled The Chinese Century with the historian Alfred McCoy. But on the next episode of History as It Happens, our focus returns to Eastern Europe and the events that led to Putin's rise, the key decisions and events that made Russia an authoritarian state again after its stab at democracy and market economics. Why did Yeltsin choose Putin? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.